Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more of the Great War. This time on to week 22. First Battle of Champagne. Dying in Caucasus snow. I always butcher the word Caucasus. I think it's the cock part. Not have said that. The multiple A's and U's. I'm very stupid. Anyways. Caucasus. 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 I don't know what I'm saying. Anyways, before we dive in, make sure you go check out the links below in the description box or in my pinned comment if I left a pinned comment. Sometimes I forget. And go join the Discord. We need more people in there so that it, is used. Join so that it's more active. Okay? They're memes. I like memes. I like looking at memes. Memes are funny. They make me haha. Anyways, week 22 of the First World War.
When the war began nearly 5 months ago, it was to be glorious, and the warring nations all saw a war.
We are 5 months out of 4 years
that would be over by Christmas. And now, hundreds of thousands of men had been butchered, civilians too, and many more horribly wounded or maimed. The war was anything but over, and today, it's Christmas. I'm Indian Idol.
Wait, hold on. Christmas? We're on the Christmas episode?
Welcome to the Great War. Last week, we saw Russian plans for an invasion of Hungary dashed with the conclusion of the Battle of Limanova. On the Western Front, the Allies were just about to begin a huge offensive as the weather worsened. There were skirmishes in Africa, and British seaside towns were bombarded by the Germans, with British civilians killed by enemy forces for the first time since the 1600s. It was pretty much a truism that the abysmal December weather was always on the side of the enemy when you were the one attacking. And the rainfall often made the trenches that now ran the length of the Western Front almost impossible to inhabit, and brought in a whole slew of new problems. Thousands of British soldiers were invalidated for trench foot, which often resulted in amputation. By Christmas, because the ground in the British sector had become, according to Commander-in-Chief John French, only a quagmire. General Smith-Dorrien went further and said, quote, "There appeared to be no stones or gravel, and rain converted the soil into a sort of liquid mud."
What did they expect? They dug into the ground.
Of the consistency of thick porridge. To walk off the roads meant sinking at once. End quote. Any structures built, like parapets, would slowly subside, and to maintain any cover at all meant constant labor, and even if you maintained cover, quite often you were unable to attack, since if the fire step had washed away, you couldn't stand high enough to fire over the parapets.
Wow.
And still, the men had to fight. As the Champagne offensive...
I mean, you could argue it's because, justifications and the beginnings of this war aren't really, justifiable for all-out war like this. Don't have to fight. The leaders could stop being dicks.
which would continue for months, began. This was the first major Allied attack on the Western Front since trench warfare took over. But the winter conditions just increased the misery and the desperation of both attacker and defender. On the 18th, the Indian Corps attacked at Germans and Givenchy, and after initial successes, taking the German frontline trenches, were met by enemy soldiers coming up a communication trench with their hands up in surrender. Right behind them, though, were machine guns ready to fire on any soldier foolish enough to show himself. At the same battle...
That's a war crime. Well, actually, this was before the Geneva Conventions, wasn't it? So at this point, it's just rude.
The Highlander troops attacking beside the Indians were unable to fire since most of their rifles had been clogged by mud from the waist-deep water of the trenches. They were captured. 2 days later, the Germans recaptured what had been lost. This pattern of give and take would repeat itself for months, in spite of the Allied numerical advantage, with men dying every single day for the smallest of temporary gains. The desperation of the attacks created great cynicism. Commander French issued orders December 21st for instant fire on any white flag shown by Germans on the Western Front, or any white flag raised on a German ship, and if in doubt whether a ship is helpless or not, it should be sunk.
That's also a war crime. No, again, 4 GM conventions. Just a dick move.
And then, suddenly, it was Christmas. On Christmas Eve, a young lieutenant,
Oh, yeah.
Sir Edward Hose, wrote in a war diary, quote, "A scout named F. Merker went out and met a German patrol and was given a glass of whiskey and some cigars, and a message was sent back saying that if we didn't fire at them, they wouldn't fire at us," end quote. That night, there on the front, the guns went silent. The next morning, one of the most remarkable scenes in the history of warfare occurred. German soldiers came walking across no man's land.
I love that they have this artwork in now. Like, is it... Okay. No, I'm assuming these are artworks and not pictures taken that are then, you know, put on the style, even though I could see that being a thing. But this looks like something that was drawn. This looks like art.
And towards the British line.
Photos that are drawn over are still art, but like what I mean is completely like envisioned by the artist and not a picture first.
And the British soldiers went out to meet them. What followed, I imagine many of you have heard of already. The enemies hung out. It was a Christmas truce. They exchanged souvenirs, cigars and chocolate, and even played football. Arrangements were made in some places to bury the dead that still littered the battlefield. The truce took place almost everywhere in British no man's land and at many places in the Belgian and French sectors. In nearly every case, actually, it was initiated by German soldiers. Here's a very interesting
initiated by the Germans.
Scene I read about in Martin Gilbert's The First World War, though it originally comes from Bruce Bairnsfather's book of Trench Tales. Quote, "The last I saw of this little affair was a vision of one of my machine gunners, who was a bit of an amateur hairdresser in civil life, cutting the unnaturally long hair of a docile Boche, who was patiently kneeling on the ground while the automatic clippers crept up the back of his neck." End quote. Commander French, when he heard of this conduct, issued orders to prevent it from ever happening again. But it didn't happen all along the line anyway, though. In Alsace, the French attacked the German positions, and actually, 9 British seaplanes attacked the German Zeppelin sheds at Cuxhaven on Christmas Day. Though in general, Christmas Day was a brief respite for the men on the Western Front. On the newest front, in the Caucasus, such was not the case.
Oh.
Back in November, the Turks had badly beaten the Russian Bergman offensive, but the Russians had now regrouped at Sarikamish. The Turks were based at Erzurum. The Russians were worried that the Turks would try to take the strategic fortress of Kars, but the Ottoman strategy was fairly simple: to make one large envelopment of the Russians using 3 different corps. There were some big difficulties here, though. One, it was winter, and in winter, northeastern Turkey is cold. 2, the war zone was well over 1,000 kilometers long, which is a hassle in good conditions, but this was all at a plateau like 2,000 meters high, and the only way to really get through was the high mountain passes or the smaller tracks where artillery couldn't go. There was also the Russian advantage that they held the Sarikamish railway line. The Ottoman forces totaled around 150,000, but they were poorly equipped, and many had no winter clothing. The Russian Caucasus army was, by contrast, well equipped, but a large part of it had been stripped to fight on the Eastern Front, leaving around 65,000 regular troops.
65,000 well-equipped Russians? That's some good numbers for Russia. Good job.
These were now bolstered by Armenian or Greek volunteers, who saw service.
Look at that pose. A unit. Look at him. I love the pose.
With the Russians as a means of securing territory with a Russian victory. Actually, the Tsar himself visited the Caucasus front December 20th, and in his search for allies told the head of the Armenian church, quote, "A most brilliant future awaits the Armenians," end quote.
Oh no.
This immediately endangered hundreds of thousands of Armenian lives, since Turkey got the idea that its own large Armenian population was a possible source of treason. Turkish maneuvers began on the 22nd, and though there were some initial successes, by Christmas Day, the men were marching over 12 hours a day through the snows of the mountain passes, exhausted, suffering frostbite, and dying of hypothermia. They hadn't even gotten to the battle yet. This was very much a week of transition, it seems, on all of the fronts. In the east, it was calm as both sides regrouped for further winter offensives, with the exception of the Austrian garrison, over 100,000 strong, still under siege behind Russian lines at Przemysl after well over a month. In the west, a great offensive had begun, but for one day, there was a remembrance of peace and brotherhood. And in the snows of Turkey, the week brought nothing but misery as the Ottoman Imperial Army marched through the mountains to meet the might of the Russians. Today's my day of quotes, apparently, so here's something from Peter Hart's The Great War. Quote, "By the end of 1914, it was evident that Alfred von Schlieffen had been both right and wrong. He was right that if the war continued for a substantial time, Germany's enemies would use their sheer press of numbers to defeat her. But in seeking a swift victory, the Germans had lost their best chance of maximizing lesser tactical gains and then negotiating peace from a position of relative strength.
Yes.
In seeking outright victory in the summer of 1914, the Germans had in the end fallen short. The war was set on a grim path of attritional fighting, with all sides engaged in attempting to degrade the opposition forces to the level that they could no longer resist.
Quote.
With all sides able to draw on millions more men, it was nigh on impossible to secure an easy victory. Far too many would die before the war would be resolved." End quote. This Christmas, today, spend a moment thinking of the millions of men fighting 100 years ago from all of the warring nations, watching their comrades killed, freezing in the mud, maybe starving in the snows, falling into despair as their world was destroyed around them, and hope, or pray, that we can learn enough from the horror that world went through to prevent it from ever happening again. On Christmas Eve 1914, one of the strangest events in military history unfolded, when 100,000 soldiers on the Western Front laid aside their arms, their orders, and their prejudices, and embraced. If you want to see our special on the Christmas truce,
This was a beautiful episode. This might be my favorite so far. This was really well paced. The information was top notch as always. But I mean, their pacing is always really good. But this one, it felt like enough was happening this week where it didn't feel like there are some weeks where not much is happening, but you know, Indy still is talking about a lot of stuff. But like, I don't know, this week felt better. I don't know how to word that. But yeah, that was the first battle of Champagne, dying in Caucasus snow, Great War, week 22, and / also Christmas truce. Thank you guys for showing up. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.